3 days after my only son's high society wedding in the heart of downtown Boston, my newly acquired daughter-in-law arrived unannounced at my historic Beacon Hill home, accompanied by a high-priced corporate attorney and a thick leather briefcase stuffed with preliminary legal papers. She flashed a practiced, chillingly radiant smile, placed a manicured hand gently on my arm, and cooed in a voice dripping with synthetic warmth, "Father Sterling, just sign right here on these dotted lines. It's only so we can take much better care of your health and manage your complex affairs as you grow older." My son, Julian, stood right behind her on the porch in a tailored Italian suit, completely unable to meet my eyes, staring fixedly down at the brass doormat as if hoping the floorboards would suddenly swallow him whole. They stood there draped in luxury, completely convinced that I was nothing more than a lonely, vulnerable old man ripe for manipulation, an easy target for a calculated corporate-style family buyout. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly fathom in their blind, unbridled greed, was that I was hiding a staggering $88 million inheritance that my brilliant late wife, Catherine, had quietly left behind in a sealed private wealth trust. And what they never expected, not even in their wildest nightmares, was that I had spent the past 3 months meticulously preparing for this exact day before they even dared to step foot through my front door. Before we dive headfirst into the harrowing wreckage of this story, let me pause for a brief moment to ask you a deeply personal question. Have you ever had to protect your life, your hard-earned dignity, and your peace from someone you once deeply loved and trusted? Please drop a quick yes or no in the comment section below right now. Your honest perspectives and raw shared stories remind me every single day that I am not just shouting out into an empty void. Please note that while this story blends deep real-world human emotion with carefully crafted fictionalized details for dramatic narrative impact, the moral message beating at the heart of it is entirely real. She had looked at me across the grand ballroom not like a loving daughter-in-law greeting her husband's grieving father on his wedding day, but rather like an experienced cardiothoracic surgeon coldly studying an organ she fully intended to harvest for parts. I should have trusted that foundational clinical instinct right then and there. My name is Dr. Jonathan Sterling. I am a 70-year-old retired cardiothoracic surgeon who spent 45 unbroken years saving human lives at the prestigious Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, working grueling 70-hour weeks, running emergency cardiac arrests, and standing for hours under harsh surgical lights to mend broken hearts. That magnificent Saturday afternoon in September, I sat at the reserved head table of the Ritz-Carlton's breathtaking grand ballroom, watching my 42-year-old son Julian marry a woman I barely knew, a stranger who had materialized out of nowhere just 8 months prior. The magnificent crystal chandeliers threw a soft, golden radiance across 200 elite guests dressed in black tie attire. A classical string quartet played a delicate arrangement by Pachelbel, and the entire room beamed with that easy, effortless joy that wedding celebrations are universally supposed to inspire. I wore my old, dependable navy blue wool suit, the very same classic suit I had proudly worn to hospital charity galas and medical association banquets for decades, and desperately tried to force myself to feel the swelling, uncomplicated happiness that a proud father is supposed to feel while watching his only child embark upon a brand new chapter of life. Julian, standing near the polished mahogany dance floor in his expensive custom-tailored suit, looked every bit the part of a high-flying investment banker on Wall Street or State Street, his confidence radiating in every deliberate gesture, every polished handshake, and every practiced smile. He looked wonderfully successful. He looked genuinely happy. He looked remarkably like the honorable son I had spent a lifetime raising to value old-fashioned hard work, absolute integrity, and moral responsibility. But it was his newly minted who stubbornly held my undivided attention throughout the afternoon. Morgan Vance, or Morgan Sterling as she had legally styled herself that very morning, was a striking 38-year-old woman who had first introduced herself to me 3 months ago under the guise of an elite holistic wellness coach and corporate stress consultant. She moved through the crowded ballroom with the practiced, predatory grace of a professional dancer, her designer silk gown catching the golden chandelier light, her smile warm, radiant, and perfectly calibrated down to the micro-expression. When she had first been brought over to meet me by Julian, she had addressed me as Father Sterling, with such an overwhelming veneer of apparent affection and reverence that I had felt a profound, swelling wave of genuine gratitude that my ambitious son had finally found someone thoughtful, grounded, and caring to share his demanding life with. Now, sitting quietly at the head table and watching her glance at me from across the crowded room while laughing with a group of bank executives, I detected something fundamentally different lingering in her dark, unblinking eyes, something intensely cold, predatory, and deeply calculating. She wasn't looking at me the way a proud new bride looks at her husband's elderly father, She was scanning, measuring, and assessing me with the exact clinical intensity I used to study complex cardiac monitors in the intensive care unit, watching intently for any subtle hidden irregularities that might signal a catastrophic underlying failure. "What on earth do you think of your gorgeous new daughter-in-law, Jonathan?" Arthur Pendleton leaned over and asked, breaking into my anxious train of thought. Arthur sat right beside me at the head table, his 68-year-old face comfortably creased with the relaxed, easygoing smile of a man thoroughly enjoying his well-earned retirement. My dearest friend from our undergraduate days at Harvard had spent 40 relentless years practicing criminal defense law in Boston before finally hanging up his courtroom robes. Yet he still quietly maintained a tight network of confidential contacts within the local FBI regional office, a fascinating administrative detail that I had instinctively filed away in the back of my mind without yet knowing why it would soon become vital to my survival. "To be entirely honest with you, Arthur, I don't really know who she is yet," I admitted quietly, keeping my voice low and steady beneath the ambient din of the string quartet. "They only met 8 months ago at some high-end wellness retreat out in western Massachusetts. It's an awfully quick engagement, very rushed." Arthur slowly studied Morgan across the far side of the room, his eyes narrowing slightly with the hardened, instinctive gaze of a man who had spent decades reading human deceit, desperation, and guilt across courtroom benches. "She certainly puts on a magnificent performance of absolute devotion to Julian," Arthur noted astutely. "She does," I agreed with a heavy sigh. Yet something deep inside my chest, the exact same clinical intuition that used to warn me when a patient's postoperative vitals looked deceptively normal but headed toward a sudden crash, keeps whispering that something is fundamentally wrong. Before Arthur could offer a counter-analysis, Morgan chose that exact microsecond to break away from the crowd and glide directly toward our table, her smile instantly brightening with radiant theatricality as she navigated smoothly through the clusters of seated guests. She reached our chairs, leaned down gracefully, and placed a warm, lingering hand directly upon my aging shoulder. Even through the heavy wool of my navy blue suit jacket, I could acutely feel the deliberate, calculated mechanics behind the gesture. Not a spontaneous touch of familial affection, but a strategic placement. "Father Sterling," she murmured softly, her voice pitched to that velvety, soothing register designed to disarm suspicion. "I am just so overwhelmingly grateful and blessed to officially be a part of this wonderful family now. Julian has told me countless moving stories about you over the past few months, about how you were the most brilliant, legendary cardiothoracic surgeon in all of Boston. A man who dedicated his entire existence to teaching his son the true value of relentless dedication, precision, and sacrifice." "Thank you, Morgan," I replied evenly, offering a polite, controlled smile. "Welcome to the Sterling family." Her dark, penetrating eyes held mine for just a fraction of a second too long, not charged with familial warmth or daughterly affection, but burning with the sharp, laser-focused intensity of an auditor conducting a hostile inventory of physical assets. When on earth did a newlywed bride ever look at her husband's elderly father and mentally calculate his total net worth down to the final dollar before the wedding cake was even cut? She finally withdrew her hand, flashed one final blinding smile, and pivoted smoothly to return to Julian's side on the dance floor. I watched them sway together to the music. My son gazed down at his bride with wide-eyed, unconditional adoration, completely wrapped around her manicured finger. But the moment Morgan assumed her husband wasn't looking, her sharp eyes darted straight back across the ballroom to lock onto me with that exact same chilling clinical assessment. I forcibly swallowed the rising knot of unease constricting my throat, deliberately pushing the dark premonition away into the darkest corners of my mind. I angrily scolded myself for being an overly paranoid, codependent old father. I desperately told myself that it was entirely natural for a man who had lost his beloved wife and spent years alone in a quiet house to feel protective, to question the lightning-fast intrusion of an unfamiliar woman into his only son's life. I forced myself to drink lukewarm champagne I couldn't truly taste, smiled warmly at wedding guests whose names I couldn't remember, and acted the part of the joyful patriarch until the ballroom lights finally dimmed. But beneath that fragile theatrical performance, the cold machinery of my mind was already turning, quietly preparing for a war I desperately hoped I would never actually have to fight. Later that same evening, after Morgan and her corporate attorney had packed up their briefcases and departed from my Beacon Hill home, leaving behind the cold realization of their preliminary legal ambush, the historic silence of my Beacon Hill home felt unusually oppressive. I sat alone in my dimly lit study, nursing a cup of black coffee while staring blankly out the multi-paned window at the cobblestone street below, trying to process the audacity of their visit. Before I could sink any deeper into my brooding thoughts, the sharp, authoritative jolt of my office landline telephone shattered the quiet air. I reached across the mahogany desk, lifted the heavy receiver, and brought it to my ear. "Hello, Jonathan." Chester Blanchard's voice boomed through the speaker, carrying the familiar, gravelly cadence of a man who had spent 4 decades navigating the chaotic politics and high-pressure corridors of Massachusetts General Hospital's cardiology department. Chester was a brilliant, meticulous electrophysiologist who had retired just 2 years before I did, and his tone possessed that distinct, urgent hesitation that always signaled bad news was about to be delivered. "Chester," I greeted him, my grip tightening instinctively around the plastic receiver. "It's good to hear from you. How is your retirement treating you down in Cape Cod?" "We'll skip the pleasantries, old friend," Chester interrupted gently, his professional edge cutting straight through the small talk. "I'm calling because something has been gnawing relentlessly at my conscience ever since I saw you at Julian's wedding on Saturday. It's about your new daughter-in-law, Morgan." My spine stiffened instantly, every clinical instinct I possessed snapping to razor-sharp attention. "What about her, Chester? Did something happen?" "I need to tell you something very disturbing, Jonathan," Chester continued, each word measured and heavy with gravity. "Did you have any earthly idea that Morgan thoroughly researched your entire family background, your medical legacy, and your estate portfolio long before she ever crossed paths with Julian?" The office around me seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. "What are you talking about, Chester?" "Julian told me they met at an exclusive corporate wellness retreat in the Berkshires just 8 months ago. That's the clever cover story they fabricated." Chester sighed heavily through the phone lines. "The absolute truth is much darker. Morgan approached me roughly 10 months ago, 2 months before she ever met Julian. She came to my office under the false pretext of seeking a medical advisory consultation for a new holistic health startup she was launching in New England. But within 10 minutes of sitting down, her questions completely pivoted away from business plans and started probing aggressively into your personal life. She asked excruciatingly detailed questions about your accumulated assets, your historic Beacon Hill property valuation, your pension, and your private inheritance plans." A cold shudder raced down my neck, freezing the blood in my veins. 10 months ago," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. "So she knew who I was before she even targeted my son." "I'm deeply afraid so, Jonathan," Chester confirmed grimly. "At the time, I thought her intense curiosity was somewhat odd and overly intrusive for a first-time meeting, but I naively assumed she was simply performing standard financial due diligence for some high-end wellness venture. It wasn't until I sat at that wedding reception on Saturday and watched her watch you across the room that the terrifying puzzle pieces finally clicked together in my head. I realized with absolute horror that I should have warned you months ago. Your son didn't stumble into a whirlwind romance, Jonathan. He was meticulously chosen, deliberately targeted, and hunted down by a woman who treated your family tree like an academic thesis project. And you, your legacy, your hard-earned wealth, you were the grand prize sitting at the very finish line all along." We spoke for another 10 minutes before I finally lowered the receiver onto its cradle, my hands shaking ever so slightly. Chester's words echoed hollowly in the empty study. The illusion of an organic, spontaneous marriage had completely shattered, replaced by the grim reality of a calculated conspiracy. My son hadn't fallen in love. He had been successfully ambushed by a professional predator. For 2 full days following Chester's bombshell phone call, I wrestled internally with what my next strategic move should be. Should I confront Julian directly with the evidence? Should I launch a quiet, comprehensive background investigation into Morgan's past? Or should I desperately hope against hope that my paranoid old mind was somehow exaggerating the threat? By Thursday evening, the suffocating weight of uncertainty drove me to action. I decided to pay an unannounced visit to Julian and Morgan's luxurious Back Bay penthouse overlooking Boston's Public Garden, carrying an expensive bottle of vintage Bordeaux as a convenient face-saving peace offering, just in case my suspicions proved entirely unfounded. Perhaps I had deeply misunderstood her professional background. Perhaps there was a completely innocent, benign explanation for her aggressive inquiries. I parked my old sedan 3 blocks away, walked briskly through the crisp autumn evening air, and used the private elevator code Julian had given me weeks earlier. When I stepped out into the private foyer of their penthouse, the double doors leading into the kitchen were propped open just a fraction of an inch. I stepped forward quietly, intending to announce my arrival, when Morgan's voice drifted out from the expansive living room, sharp, triumphant, and utterly devoid of domestic warmth. "If I hadn't meticulously targeted and married your naive, ambitious little son, I never would have gotten my hands on your stubborn old father's massive asset portfolio." Morgan sneered with casual, chilling confidence. The heavy wine bottle felt suddenly leaden and suffocating in my grip. Through the narrow gap in the double doors, I could see the back of Julian's head as he slumped dejectedly into a plush leather sofa, while Morgan stood directly before him, her arms crossed over her designer blouse, looking down at her husband with absolute contempt. He guards his accumulated capital far too aggressively. Morgan, Julian muttered defensively, his voice carrying the weary tone of a man who had long since surrendered whatever moral backbone he once possessed. The old man is stubborn as a mule. He lives like a hermit in that drafty historic house and refuses to touch his wealth. That is precisely why we have to orchestrate this move with surgical precision. Morgan countered smoothly, her tone shifting into the crisp, ruthless efficiency of a corporate raider presenting a hostile takeover bid. But if we play our cards right as legal family members, we can systematically manipulate him into trusting us. We will force him to sign comprehensive legal documents, transferring full administrative control of his trusts and properties over to us before his mind gets too foggy to understand what he's actually signing away. And what happens if the stubborn old bastard flat out refuses to sign? Julian asked nervously, shifting uncomfortably on the leather cushions. Morgan let out a soft, venomous laugh that sent a fresh wave of ice water straight down my spine. He won't refuse, darling. I've already mapped out every single contingency plan. He's 70 years old, increasingly isolated, and deep down, desperate to believe his only son genuinely loves and respects him. We will lovingly convince him that transferring asset control is entirely for his own good, purely for his ultimate protection as he ages. Trust is merely a temporary tool, Julian. Absolute legal control is permanent. We need those preliminary power of attorney deeds, property transfer authorizations, and bank access codes executed and signed within the next 14 days, or my secondary financial obligations will catch up with us. Standing frozen behind the kitchen wall in the dimly lit hallway, listening to my flesh and blood casually plot my financial execution alongside a cold-blooded sociopath, I didn't feel a sudden rush of white-hot rage or blind panic. Instead, a profound, chilling clarity settled over my consciousness, the exact same ice-cold emotional detachment I used to experience decades ago inside the operating room, when a patient's cardiac monitor flatlined during an emergency bypass and everyone else in the surgical suite panicked except me. My son wasn't an innocent victim being ruthlessly manipulated by an evil mastermind against his will. He was an enthusiastic, fully cognizant, and eager participant in his own father's financial slaughter. He had consciously chosen greed over filial loyalty. I silently set the expensive bottle of Bordeaux down on the marble kitchen counter, turned on my heel, and walked softly back to the private elevator, my footsteps making zero sound on the plush Persian rug. Neither of them had any earthly idea I had been standing mere feet away. Neither of them knew their treasonous conspiracy had just been witnessed by the very man they intended to destroy. But as damning and sickening as their living room plot was, it was merely the predictable tip of a much deeper, vastly more sinister iceberg. Back in my Beacon Hill study that night, driven by an overwhelming urge to uncover the full extent of Morgan's dark history, I locked my study door, fired up my desktop computer, and dove headfirst into restricted medical board databases, cross-referencing disciplinary records across multiple states. It didn't take long for my surgical training and thorough research to unearth the horrifying truth. Morgan Vance wasn't just an ambitious, gold-digging wellness coach with a polished veneer. She was a disgraced, deregistered medical professional hiding under a carefully curated alias. State Medical Board archives from Nevada revealed that Dr. Morgan Vance had held an active internal medicine license until March of 2019, at which point her license was permanently suspended and revoked, following an explosive series of formal disciplinary investigations into severe professional malpractice, inappropriate prescription practices, and potential patient harm. The records detailed a terrifying pattern of behavior. She had systematically targeted vulnerable, wealthy elderly patients under her direct care, covertly administering controlled substances and prescription sedatives to artificially induce prolonged states of cognitive confusion, memory loss, and severe disorientation, all while quietly manipulating their vulnerable families into signing over power of attorney and estate executorship. Worse still, buried deeper within the confidential legal archives were public disclosure summaries confirming that Morgan had been directly implicated in at least 2 major civil lawsuits filed by grieving families, lawsuits that had been quietly settled out of court through massive, non-disclosure-bound financial payouts before ever reaching a public jury trial. She hadn't just studied pharmaceutical manipulation out of academic curiosity. She was a seasoned predatory predator who had literally weaponized her medical degree to systematically drug, rob, and psychologically destroy elderly patients for profit, fleeing eastward to Boston after her Nevada career collapsed in flames to reinvent herself as a luxury wellness coach and hunt down a brand new victim with an even larger fortune. As I stared down at the glowing computer screen, displaying her suspended medical license and disgraced history, the chilling dimensions of her master plan clicked into place with horrifying perfection. She wasn't simply planning to trick me into signing ordinary legal documents through emotional persuasion. She was preparing to chemically lobotomize me with pharmaceutical precision, slowly poisoning my cardiovascular and neurological systems to make my engineered demise look like natural cardiac arrest. The war had officially been declared, and the enemy was already inside the gates. An hour after unearthing Morgan's deeply sinister medical disciplinary records from Nevada, documenting a chilling history of professional malpractice, fraudulent prescriptions, and the targeted exploitation of vulnerable elderly patients, I stood alone in the absolute darkness of my historic Beacon Hill study, pulling a locked aluminum case from the bottom drawer of my heavy mahogany filing cabinet. Inside rested a collection of miniature microcameras, high-definition pinhole lenses, and state-of-the-art audio recording bugs that I had once secretly utilized decades ago for clinical medical documentation, capturing delicate surgical procedures, recording complex patient consultations with strict institutional consent, and archiving intricate anatomical operations for teaching purposes at Massachusetts General Hospital. It was sophisticated microtechnology that I had permanently retired the exact day I walked away from active hospital practice 5 years prior, assuming I would never again have any earthly need for covert electronic surveillance. Now, holding one of the tiny matte black optical lenses up to the soft desk lamp to inspect its microscopic battery charge, I discovered to my grim satisfaction that the internal lithium power cells were still fully functional, perfectly capable of streaming high-definition video and crystal-clear audio over encrypted local frequencies for weeks on end. My hands did not tremble as I methodically assembled the surveillance hardware, perfectly steady under mounting pressure. 45 grueling years of standing under blazing surgical lights had taught me an unshakable emotional steadiness, an absolute control over micromotor movements when a patient's life hung by a fragile thread on the operating table. I had spent a lifetime learning to read subtle cardiac anomalies on high-tech monitors, scanning relentlessly for the minor, hidden electrical irregularities that signal an imminent, catastrophic arrest. But standing there in the quiet stillness of my study room, an overwhelming, sickening wave of realization washed over me. My own son's emotional and moral heart had flatlined completely years ago, and I had foolishly missed every single warning sign along the way. I reached out across the desk and picked up my secure landline phone, dialing the familiar, trusted direct number of Arthur Pendleton. "Arthur," I answered warmly as he picked up, his resonant voice carrying the sharp, authoritative cadence of a seasoned veteran of the criminal courtroom. "I need your legal counsel and confidential access to your quiet contacts within the local FBI regional office." The warmth evaporated from Arthur's voice in an instant, replaced seamlessly by the razor-sharp, hyper-focused attention of the elite criminal defense attorney he had spent 4 decades being. "What on earth has happened, Jonathan? Talk to me." Without holding back a single horrifying detail, I laid the entire web of treachery out before him. I recounted Chester Blanchard's chilling warning about Morgan's pre-wedding corporate reconnaissance, my accidental eavesdropping behind the kitchen wall of their luxury Back Bay penthouse, and the damning Nevada Medical Board suspension records proving her history of drugging vulnerable elderly patients for financial enrichment. When I finally finished speaking, an absolute suffocating silence stretched across the telephone line for several long, agonizing seconds. "Good God, Jonathan," Arthur finally breathed out, his voice dropping an octave with grave professional shock. "This moves miles past ordinary gold-digging or opportunistic marital fraud. We are looking at premeditated wire fraud, large-scale financial conspiracy, and systemic elder abuse. If they are actively planning to forge legal documents, fabricate medical incompetence, and manipulate you into signing away total control of your multi-million-dollar estate under false pretenses, we are staring down the barrel of severe federal indictments." "I am acutely aware of what they are planning, Arthur," I replied evenly, my voice remaining an anchor of chilling composure. "And I want to officially request formal assistance and preliminary surveillance authorization from the FBI Boston field office to gather concrete, legally admissible evidence before they make their final move." Arthur remained quiet for a brief moment, mentally stressed, testing the legal parameters of my strategy. Given the severity of the threat and her history of pharmaceutical manipulation of vulnerable patients, I can formally petition Supervisory Special Agent Marcus Holland at the Boston field office for an emergency surveillance warrant and authorized technical deployment, Arthur agreed cautiously. "Once federal authorization is officially secured under my legal counsel, an authorized FBI technical team will quietly coordinate with you to plant high-definition monitoring equipment inside the penthouse. But Jonathan, let me issue you a stern warning. This game is exceptionally dangerous. If they catch even a fleeting whiff that you are fully aware of their treasonous conspiracy, all bets are off. I have spent 45 years playing the role of the calm, objective, all-knowing patriarch for a son who took my unconditional love for granted, I answered coldly. I can comfortably maintain that theatrical performance a little longer. 2 days later, following the official issuance of the federal surveillance authorization obtained through Arthur Pendleton, I met discreetly with an authorized FBI technical specialist at a quiet staging location outside Boston, equipped with state-of-the-art federal micro cameras and covert audio recording bugs, and utilizing a secure window of time when Morgan and Julian were attending an all-day corporate seminar across town. I used the private elevator access code Julian had given me months ago to enter their Back Bay penthouse. Moving with the practiced, effortless muscle memory of 4 decades inside high-pressure operating rooms, I methodically installed the high-definition pinhole camera beneath the formal living room sofa table, concealed the high-fidelity audio bug inside the cascading silk orchid floral arrangement, and secured the third pinhole camera behind the abstract modernist painting in Julian's home office. Total installation time, exactly 7 minutes and 40 seconds. My hands were as steady as stone. 2 days later, sitting safely in the locked darkness of my Beacon Hill study with the heavy velvet curtains tightly drawn across the windows, I finally connected to the encrypted digital feed monitored jointly by Arthur and the FBI technical unit. I slipped a pair of professional noise-canceling studio headphones over my ears, adjusted the frequency tuning dial, and locked onto the secure audio feed broadcasting live from the Back Bay penthouse. For the first 20 minutes, the headphones transmitted little more than benign ambient noise, the low, steady hum of a high-end Viking refrigerator, the distant, muffled murmur of city traffic pulsing up from the street far below, and the occasional faint creak of hardwood floorboards as invisible occupants moved about the space. Then suddenly, Morgan's sharp, confident voice cut cleanly through the static, shattering the silence. "He is utterly clueless, Julian," Morgan's voice echoed through the headset, dripping with a cold, triumphant arrogance. "He suspects absolutely nothing. He's just a lonely, increasingly confused old man who is desperate to believe his only ungrateful son still loves and respects him. Our preliminary timeline for the estate acquisition is right on schedule. Are you completely certain the legal mechanisms will hold up under intense financial scrutiny once we execute the transfers?" Julian's voice responded, carrying an unmistakable undertone of nervous apprehension. "Absolute perfection requires zero doubt," Morgan retorted sharply, her tone shifting into the crisp, ruthless efficiency of a seasoned criminal mastermind. "We move forward precisely as we discussed. First, we finalize the forged power of attorney deeds and property transfer authorizations through our underground contact in South Philadelphia, who asks 0 questions for the right price. But that is merely the preliminary administrative phase. The real masterpiece of this operation relies entirely on the pharmaceutical protocol. I froze instantly in my high-backed leather chair, every muscle in my body locking into rigid tension. My pen hovered motionless over the yellow legal pad resting beneath my hand. "Explain the pharmaceutical protocol to me again, Morgan," Julian pressed, his voice trembling slightly, "just to ensure we are completely aligned on the mechanics." Morgan let out a cold clinical laugh that echoed chillingly inside my headphones. "It is remarkably simple, darling, and brilliantly undetectable if executed with absolute surgical precision. Once we present the preliminary power of attorney documents and he inevitably attempts to resist or stall out of stubborn pride, we begin the daily administration of low-dose benzodiazepines directly into his morning coffee or evening tea. We maintain micro-dosages over a sustained, carefully monitored 30-day window." My medical mind raced violently, racing ahead of her words to calculate the devastating physiological impact. Benzodiazepines, fast-acting central nervous system depressants like lorazepam or alprazolam, when administered covertly to an elderly individual over an extended period, systematically disrupt cognitive processing, induce profound memory fragmentation, severely impair executive functioning, and generate clinical symptoms that perfectly mimic progressive senile dementia or accelerated cognitive decline. Any attending geriatric physician or independent medical evaluator examining him would readily certify his mental incompetence based on the engineered presentation alone, making his signature on complex estate documents legally vulnerable and easily contested. "And what is the ultimate endgame of the 30-day protocol, Morgan?" Julian asked, his voice dropping into a hushed, conspiratorial whisper. "Does he just permanently lose his cognitive faculties and sign over the accounts?" The terrifying gravity of Morgan's true objective dropped like an atomic bomb through my headphones, freezing the blood in my veins and stopping my breath entirely. "Oh no, Julian, my sweet, naive boy," Morgan corrected him softly, her voice carrying an eerie, sociopathic warmth that was infinitely more terrifying than outright rage. "Signing the documents is merely the stepping stone to the final prize. The ultimate objective of the 30-day pharmaceutical protocol isn't merely to induce synthetic dementia or facilitate a peaceful financial takeover. It is to systematically orchestrate a completely natural medical fatality within precisely 30 days of the initial microdose. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead, soaking through my collar. A natural fatality? Julian stammered, horror and greed warring savagely in his voice. Are you out of your mind? How on earth do you orchestrate a natural fatality without triggering a mandatory police autopsy or toxicological investigation? Through exquisite pharmacological manipulation, you absolute fool, Morgan hissed, her patience wearing thin. Your precious father is 70 years old, possesses an extensive, highly documented history of underlying cardiovascular disease, and has already survived 2 major coronary bypass surgeries earlier in his life. His ticker is an absolute ticking time bomb. By systematically combining microdosages of fast-acting benzodiazepines with specific cardiovascular stress compounds over a strict 30-day window, we will artificially induce acute cardiac stress and progressive heart failure. The regimen would create confusion, weakness, and dangerous cardiac stress that could make a death initially appear consistent with his history. The attending medical examiner will look at his 70-year-old medical charts, observe his well-documented history of severe heart disease, review the engineered cognitive confusion, and comfortably sign off on a completely natural death certificate citing cardiac arrest due to advanced age and chronic natural pathology. The $88 million trust fund transfers automatically to you as sole surviving primary heir within 48 hours of his passing, clean, untraceable, and legally impregnable. By the time anyone outside the family begins asking probing questions, I will be halfway across the globe, sitting on a pristine beach in the South Pacific with a brand new passport, a multi-million-dollar offshore holding account, and a brand new identity. My God, Morgan, you're actually planning to murder my father, Julian whispered. The words tumbling out of his mouth not as an expression of moral outrage or horrified rejection, but rather as the breathless, terrified realization of a man staring down the barrel of an absolute, irreversible point of no return. I am not murdering anyone, Julian. Morgan corrected him smoothly, her voice ice-cold and utterly devoid of human conscience. We are simply accelerating a biological inevitability to secure our rightful financial future. Now shut up, pour yourself a glass of scotch, and pull up the asset portfolio spreadsheets. We have preliminary legal documents to review before I head out to meet our notary contact in South Philadelphia. I slowly pulled the noise-canceling headphones off my ears, placing them down on the mahogany desk with infinite care, as absolute, freezing silence consumed my Beacon Hill study. The chilling reality of what I had just intercepted hung heavily in the air around me. My son's opportunistic gold-digging wife hadn't simply devised a clever white-collar scam to steal an old man's accumulated savings through fraudulent paperwork. She was a dangerous, serial medical predator who had weaponized her disgraced pharmaceutical background to engineer a cold-blooded, untraceable assassination plot designed to murder me in cold blood within 30 days. And my own flesh and blood had willingly enlisted as an accomplice to his own father's execution. The gloves were completely off, the war lines were irrevocably drawn, and as I looked over at the framed photograph of my late wife Catherine smiling gently from the bookshelf, I knew with absolute, unyielding certainty that I would use every single ounce of my medical expertise, my legal alliances, and my remaining breath to turn their perfect, flawless murder plot into the federal prison sentence that would swallow them both whole. The chilling revelation of Morgan's 30-day pharmaceutical assassination plot and Julian's cowardly complicity did not drive me to panic or precipitate a frantic, emotional flight from my historic Beacon Hill home. Instead, it ignited a cold, calculated, and mathematically precise determination within my soul. 45 grueling years of standing under blazing surgical lights had taught me an absolute, unbreakable truth. When you are confronted with a malignant, metastasized tumor hidden deep within a patient's core, you do not simply shout at it or run away in terror. You systematically isolate it, map out its exact cellular contours, and delicately construct an inescapable surgical trap that ensures its complete and total eradication. I wasn't going to hide, I wasn't going to pack my bags, and I certainly wasn't going to cower in fear inside my own ancestral home. I was going to willingly step directly into the lion's den, wrap myself in the theatrical cloak of a frail, cognitively collapsing old man, and actively hand my parasitic daughter-in-law the exact sharpened rope she desperately craved to hang herself with. The very next Sunday morning, less than 48 hours after intercepting their treasonous conversations through our federal bugs, I climbed into my sedan and drove across Boston to the Back Bay residential tower, purposefully timing my arrival to coincide precisely with their late morning coffee routine. When the private elevator doors slid open into the penthouse foyer, I deliberately altered my physical posture, rounding my shoulders forward, allowing my stride to become shuffling and unsteady, and wearing an expression of deep, vacant disorientation. I pushed open the double doors using a trembling hand, stepping tentatively into the expansive living room where Julian and Morgan were quietly reviewing financial spreadsheets. "Good morning, Father Sterling." Morgan greeted me instantly, her dark eyes flashing with a predatory, triumphant spark that she only partially managed to mask beneath a thin veneer of hypocritical sweetness. "How wonderful of you to drop by unannounced. Are you feeling entirely well today?" I paused near the edge of the formal dining table, blinking my eyes heavily as if struggling to focus on her face, and let out a confused, raspy sigh. "Well, good morning, my dear," I mumbled slowly, pitching my vocal inflection to a soft, hesitant quiver. "To be entirely honest with you, Morgan, I woke up feeling rather foggy. My head feels terribly heavy today. What day of the week is this anyway? Is it Tuesday or perhaps Thursday?" Julian slowly stood up from the designer sofa, walking toward me with a visibly strained expression that hovered somewhere between deep-seated guilt and greedy anticipation. "Dad, it's Sunday," Julian said, his voice tightening nervously. "Remember, you came over to visit us for our weekend coffee? Sunday?" "Ah, yes, of course, Sunday," I murmured vacantly, shaking my head with a slow, exaggerated motion of cognitive confusion. My memory has been playing absolute tricks on me lately. Names slip right out of my mind, and I keep forgetting why I walked into rooms. It's terribly frustrating getting old, Julian. Across the room, I watched Morgan instantly exchange a rapid, intensely meaningful glance with my son. A silent, gleeful communication that screamed the pharmaceutical conditioning is already working far faster and more effectively than anticipated. She glided across the polished hardwood floor with predatory grace, stepped right up to my side, and placed a warm, sympathetic hand upon my trembling arm, her touch carrying the fake, nauseating compassion of a professional con artist. "Oh, you poor dear man," Morgan cooed smoothly, her voice dripping with manufactured empathy. "It is completely understandable to feel overwhelmed by complex asset management and heavy estate logistics when your cognitive processing is declining. That is precisely why Julian and I love you so fiercely and want to lift this crushing administrative burden entirely off your shoulders. We brought the preliminary legal documents down from the study, the power of attorney authorizations and property transfer deeds we discussed last week. If you sign them right now while you are here with us, we can immediately take care of all the paperwork, protect your massive estate from external probate complications, and ensure your absolute peace of mind for the remainder of your years." She didn't waste a single microsecond of time. Within 60 seconds, Morgan had retrieved a thick leather portfolio from the side desk, spreading out a dozen formal legal forms across the mahogany coffee table right in front of me. Every single document was meticulously formatted with complex legal jargon designed to look entirely legitimate to an untrained eye. But my mind, honed by decades of high-stakes medical precision, was operating at razor-sharp, hyper-vigilant capacity beneath my theatrical display of senility. I lowered myself heavily onto the leather sofa, letting out a convincing, ragged breath of exhaustion, and picked up a heavy gold fountain pen that Morgan eagerly pressed into my trembling fingers. "Sign right here on the designated lines, Father Sterling," Morgan instructed softly, pointing her manicured fingernail directly at the primary signature boxes while hovering over me like an executioner watching an inmate step toward the gallows. I leaned over the documents, intentionally making my hand shake violently as I gripped the pen nib. To ensure the legal documents were completely worthless while simultaneously driving them into a blind, desperate frenzy, I deliberately executed a flawless masterclass in deception. On the first power of attorney authorization form, I purposely misspelled my own surname, scratching out a messy, completely fictitious spelling, Jonathan Sterling instead of Jonathan Sterling. On the second asset transfer deed, I purposefully stopped writing halfway through my first name, let out a confused groan, and looked up at Morgan with wide, panic-stricken eyes. "Oh dear, my hand is shaking so badly I can barely remember how to spell my own Christian name," I stammered, my voice trembling with theatrical vulnerability. "Did I spell it right, Morgan? Is it Jonathan or Jon?" Morgan's jaw tightened visibly, a flash of pure, unadulterated frustration crossing her features before she forced her practiced smile back into place. "Don't you worry about minor spelling errors or shaky handwriting for a single second, Father Sterling," she urged quickly, pressing down on my wrist to force the pen back to the paper. "Just keep signing right down the line. Everything will be properly processed and filed away safely." I dutifully signed 6 more pages, each signature progressively worse, more distorted, and more blatantly illegible than the last, deliberately crafting a chaotic scribbled mess that any competent bank teller or trust officer would instantly reject for suspected fraud or cognitive incapacity. Yet, blinded by their unbridled greed and absolute arrogance, Morgan and Julian stared down at the disastrous paperwork with glowing, triumphant expressions, completely convinced they had successfully captured the $88 million prize. However, what they didn't know was that while they were celebrating their premature victory in the Back Bay penthouse, a much larger, catastrophic trap was rapidly closing around them behind the scenes. Unbeknownst to Morgan and Julian, my loyal wealth manager at First Republic Private Bank, Una Gomez had already locked down my accounts under a rigid, impenetrable Level 5 security hold. This meant that any formal attempt to execute asset transfers, modify trust beneficiaries, or seize power of attorney over my multi-million-dollar estate required absolute biometric signature verification, mandatory in-person notarized witness testimony, and direct multi-factor verbal authentication from me personally. When Morgan rushed down to the bank the following afternoon to file the disastrous, violently misspelled documents I had signed during my theatrical performance, the senior trust officers took one look at the chaotic signatures, immediately flagged the paperwork for suspected elder financial exploitation, and quietly notified my legal counsel, Arthur Pendleton. Within minutes, faced with an impenetrable banking wall and realizing that my obviously degraded, shaky handwriting would never pass formal institutional audit standards, Morgan panicked completely. Driven by an insane, desperate urgency to loot the estate before the Level 5 bank security holds became permanent, she completely abandoned all caution and crossed the absolute threshold of federal criminality. Unbeknownst to her, our hidden federal living room cameras recorded every single frantic telephone conversation she initiated over the next 48 hours as she frantically sought out illicit alternatives. Hearing her voice through our encrypted monitoring feed screaming in pure frustration at an anonymous underground contact, "The signatures are complete garbage. He can barely write his own name anymore. We need the professional right now regardless of the cost," was the definitive confirmation Arthur and the FBI had been waiting for. Consumed by her desperation, Morgan recklessly authorized a $15,000 cash payment to a notorious deregistered document counterfeiter named Quinn Perkins, operating out of a heavily converted row house in South Philadelphia. Furthermore, she scoured the dark web to hire a 67-year-old struggling stage actor named Theodore Yates, paying him an $8,000 cash fee to physically impersonate me, wear a gray wig and reading glasses, and fraudulently sign my name before Quinn Perkinson's corrupt, forged notary seal. They were stepping straight into the federal dragnet. As Morgan eagerly coordinated the final logistics of the illegal notarization meeting, completely unaware that federal investigators from the FBI Boston field office were actively monitoring her burner phone communications under Arthur Pendleton's direct legal coordination, I sat quietly in the dark sanctuary of my Beacon Hill study, holding my warm coffee mug, and quietly marveled at the staggering hubris of human greed. She thought she was the master chess player executing a flawless, untouchable corporate takeover. In reality, she was nothing more than a desperate cornered pawn walking willingly into an inescapable federal trap, directly filming and documenting every single felony she committed under the unforgiving, unblinking lens of federal law. The cold, gray morning fog of early November rolled heavily off Boston Harbor, shrouding the soaring glass towers of the financial district and casting an ominous silvery glow over the Back Bay skyline. It was exactly 7:45 in the morning when my battered, unassuming sedan rolled quietly to a complete stop 3 blocks away from the luxury residential tower, where Julian and Morgan's high-priced penthouse occupied the crown of the building. Inside my car, sitting in the passenger seat with the quiet, focused composure of a veteran military strategist, was Arthur Pendleton, flanked by a secure tactical radio connecting us directly to Supervisory Special Agent Marcus Holland of the FBI's Boston field office. We had spent the past 72 hours compiling the ultimate, impenetrable dossier of federal crimes, high-definition video footage capturing Morgan covertly dropping pharmaceutical sedatives into my morning coffee glass, crystal-clear audio files recording their calculated 30-day murder plot, forensic copies of the illegally forged property transfer deeds, high-resolution surveillance photographs of the corrupt notary Quinn Perkins applying his fake seal, and sworn affidavits from my bank manager Una Gomez verifying the Level 5 financial security holds. The net was fully woven, every single thread was anchored in unbreakable federal statute, and the digital countdown to the execution of the warrants was rapidly flashing zero. At precisely 8 a.m. on the dot, a synchronized team of 4 unmarked federal black SUVs swung effortlessly around the corner, pulling up directly beneath the grand porte cochere of the residential tower. Before the street-level security guards could even register what was happening, 12 heavily armed tactical agents from the FBI's elite white-collar crime and felony apprehension unit swarmed the private lobby elevators, moving with the terrifying speed, surgical precision, and absolute authority that only comes from executing high-stakes federal warrants. I sat quietly in the front seat of my car alongside Arthur, watching the live tactical feed stream onto a secure tablet screen resting on my dashboard. Through the high-definition helmet-mounted camera of Agent Holland, I watched the lead tactical squad step silently out of the private elevator car directly onto the penthouse's private top-floor foyer. With a synchronized, devastating mechanical crack, the reinforced mahogany double doors of the penthouse were cleanly splintered off their heavy iron hinges, flying inward with a thunderous crash that shattered the morning quiet of the luxury apartment. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Nobody move. Hands where we can see them right now. 8 deep, perfectly synchronized voices bellowed in unison, echoing off the minimalist designer walls as the tactical team flooded the living room with assault-style rifles raised and federal badges proudly displayed. Within 30 seconds, the secondary tactical sweep team breached the master bedroom suite where Julian and Morgan were still deep asleep, completely oblivious to the fact that their multi-million-dollar criminal empire was violently imploding around them. Agent Holland's voice rang out flat, merciless, and echoing through the live audio feed. Julian Sterling and Morgan Sterling, you are both under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, federal elder financial abuse, forgery, and identity theft. You have the right to remain silent. I unbuckled my seatbelt, pushed open the car door, and stepped out onto the cool Boston pavement, walking steadily toward the tower's main entrance. By the time I rode the elevator up to the penthouse and stepped across the splintered threshold of the double doors, the chaotic theater of the raid had already transitioned into the cold, methodical efficiency of evidence collection and asset seizure. Tactical agents were moving systematically through every room, wearing blue latex gloves and slipping pristine audio bugs, micro cameras, computer hard drives, and signed financial documents into clear federal evidence bags. In the center of the formal living room stood my son and my daughter-in-law, both clad in expensive silk pajamas, their wrists locked painfully behind their backs in heavy steel handcuffs. Morgan Vance, or Morgan Sterling, stood rigidly upright, her posture stiff, her face carved entirely into an expression of cold, unyielding, defiant calculation. Even with armed federal agents surrounding her and shiny steel cuffs biting into her wrists, her dark eyes weren't filled with panic or tearful remorse. Instead, her hyper-analytical mind was already spinning wildly, aggressively searching through her mental index of criminal defense statutes, looking for procedural loopholes, technical constitutional infractions, or jurisdictional errors she could exploit the moment she sat down with a federal public defender. She was a remorseless, clinical predator to her very core, completely incapable of experiencing genuine human empathy, treating her catastrophic arrest not as a moral defeat, but merely as an unexpected tactical setback in an ongoing corporate war. Beside her, however, Julian presented an entirely different, heartbreaking spectacle of absolute psychological collapse. The moment his wild, terrified eyes caught sight of me stepping calmly across the ruined doorway, standing completely upright, breathing steadily without a hint of confusion, cognitive decline, or physical infirmity, his knees completely buckled beneath him. The polished veneer of the high-flying investment banker vanished in a blinding flash of reality, replaced by a pathetic broken man staring into the absolute abyss of his own destruction. Dad, please!" Julian shrieked hysterically, throwing his weight forward as he thrashed against the steel cuffs, tears streaming uncontrollably down his pale cheeks as his voice cracked into a ragged, desperate wail. "Tell them, please, Dad. You have to tell these agents this is all a horrible mistake. I'm your only son. I love you. Please, you can't just let them take me away like this. Please help me." I did not flinch, I did not look away, and I did not utter a single syllable. I simply stood there at the edge of the living room, hands resting quietly inside my coat pockets, looking down at my 42-year-old son with an expression of profound, chilling detachment. It was the exact same clinical, unblinking gaze I used to maintain decades ago inside the operating room when standing before an advanced, inoperable malignancy. The silent, heavy stare of a veteran surgeon who had officially laid down his scalpel because he recognized that the tissue before him was necrotic, entirely beyond human salvation, and destined only for excision to save the rest of the body. My steady, motionless gaze communicated everything language failed to capture. I was never confused, I was never losing my mind, and I was never your victim. I spent the last 3 months hunting you down while you arrogantly thought you were hunting me. Agent Holland gave a sharp nod to his tactical subordinates, and 2 federal officers firmly gripped Julian by the shoulders, steering him toward the private elevator while his frantic sobbing screams echoed off the penthouse walls. 2 other agents flanked Morgan, leading her out with steady, uncompromising force while her cold, calculating eyes remained locked on mine until the heavy elevator doors slid shut, sealing them away in the federal transport system. Concurrently, Arthur Pendleton received urgent text updates on his secure mobile device, confirming that simultaneous tactical raids executed by local and federal authorities in South Philadelphia and Fishtown had successfully resulted in the immediate, unresisting arrests of both Quinn Perkins, the corrupt notary, and Theodore Yates, the aging actor who had attempted to impersonate me. All 4 primary conspirators were securely locked inside federal custody within 15 minutes of the initial breach. More than a year later, the final, inescapable gavel of federal justice finally fell inside courtroom 302 of the monumental John Joseph Moakley U.S. Courthouse, towering majestically over the windswept Boston waterfront. The high-ceilinged, mahogany-paneled courtroom was packed to absolute capacity with journalists, legal scholars, and federal prosecutors as Judge Ellen Kaufman, a formidable 62-year-old federal district judge, with 3 decades of unyielding bench experience specializing in white-collar racketeering and financial crimes, sat sternly behind the elevated judicial bench. She had spent the entire 3-week federal trial reviewing every single shred of incontrovertible evidence we had meticulously constructed. The high-definition video of Morgan poisoning my morning coffee glass, the crystal-clear audio recordings mapping out their premeditated murder plot, the forensic handwriting analysis proving massive forgery, and the irrefutable bank security records. The defendants will rise for sentencing, Judge Kaufman's voice commanded, cutting cleanly through the pin-drop silence of the packed courtroom like a razor-sharp scalpel. Julian and Morgan stood side by side before the judicial bench, both dressed in coarse, bright orange federal prison jumpsuits, their ankles and wrists bound in heavy security shackles, carrying the visible toll of extended months spent inside maximum security detention units. Julian Sterling and Morgan Sterling, Judge Kaufman began, her voice carrying the cold, measured cadence of absolute, unbending legal authority. The sheer, unimaginable depravity of conspiring to systematically drug and murder your own aging father, a man who dedicated 45 years of his life to saving human lives, for the sole purpose of looting an $88 million estate, represents the absolute lowest depths of human nature. You weaponized family trust, manufactured fraudulent legal instruments, and planned an execution with cold, calculated pharmaceutical precision. This court shows absolutely zero mercy, zero tolerance, and zero leniency toward parasitic predators who ruthlessly prey upon vulnerable family members. For the combined federal charges of conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, elder financial exploitation, forgery, and identity theft, I hereby sentence each of you to 25 years in federal prison. The heavy sentences landed upon the courtroom like sledgehammer blows. Morgan's icy, defiant mask finally fractured for a fleeting fraction of a second, her pale lips parting in sheer disbelief as the reality of spending her prime adulthood behind iron bars finally settled over her soul. Julian slumped forward, his head dropping heavily against his chest as muffled, defeated sobs racked his frail frame. As federal marshals unlocked their shackles and forcefully escorted them down the subterranean hallway toward the holding cells, Julian turned his head one final time toward the public gallery, his tear-filled eyes scanning desperately until they locked onto me sitting quietly in the back row. "Father, please," he choked out in a desperate, broken whisper that barely reached my ears. "Forgive me, please." I slowly stood up from my wooden bench, adjusted the lapels of my navy blue wool suit with absolute calm precision, and turned toward the massive oak exit doors. I searched deep within my heart for some lingering fragment of paternal grief, some residual warmth of the boy I had raised, coached through Little League, and cheered for at graduation, but I found nothing. The stranger in the orange jumpsuit was merely a ghost wearing my son's face, a tragic, self-inflicted casualty of unbridled greed who had chosen to make war against his own creator. I pushed open the heavy courthouse doors and stepped out into the bright, crisp Boston sunlight, letting the heavy oak panels click shut behind me with the final, absolute permanence of a tomb ceiling sealing away the past. Several months after the federal gavel came down inside the John Joseph Moakley U.S. Courthouse, sentencing Julian and Morgan to 25 years in federal prison, the heavy, chaotic storm of betrayal finally cleared away from my life, leaving behind an immense, profound, and permanent silence. The historic federal-style brick home on Beacon Hill felt larger, quieter, and vastly emptier than it ever had before, its antique hallways echoing only with the steady ticking of grandfather clocks and the ghosts of a family that existed now only in memory. Yet beneath that vast, suffocating solitude, a deep, unshakable peace had settled over my soul. The calm, restorative stillness of a patient who has successfully survived a radical, life-saving surgical excision. The time for defensive vigilance had passed, and the sacred time for establishing an enduring legacy had officially arrived. On a crisp, bright Tuesday morning in early March, I drove my old sedan down into the towering glass and steel canyons of Boston's financial district. Parking in the subterranean garage beneath a sleek skyscraper where Arthur Pendleton's premier estate and corporate law firm maintained its mahogany-paneled offices, Arthur Pendleton greeted me at the double-glass doors of his private corner office with a grave, respectful nod, his silver hair catching the brilliant morning light streaming across Boston Harbor. Across the polished oak conference table sat Una Gomez, my loyal private wealth manager from First Republic Private Bank, whose impenetrable Level 5 security holds had acted as the ultimate financial shield during the height of the conspiracy. They sat in quiet, solemn anticipation as I slid off my winter coat, walked steadily to the head of the table, and rested a heavy leather portfolio squarely between us. "Jonathan," Arthur began, his voice steady, calm, and deeply reassuring as he adjusted his classic reading glasses. "Are you entirely certain you are ready to execute these final testamentary adjustments without any lingering hesitation?" "I have never been more certain or clear-headed in my entire life, Arthur," I replied evenly, my voice as cold and steady as surgical steel. "Let us review the final asset distribution framework to ensure it is completely ironclad, legally bulletproof, and utterly impervious to any future civil challenges or inheritance contests." Arthur tapped his fountain pen against the primary document, guiding our collective attention down the dense lines of formal legal prose. "Very well. Pursuant to your precise instructions, we have completely overhauled every prior testamentary instrument you ever drafted. Let us examine the new allocations." He cleared his throat softly. "First and foremost, concerning your 42-year-old son, Julian Sterling, the revised instrument explicitly, comprehensively, and irrevocably disenhides him from your entire estate. He shall not receive a single cent, a single stock share, a single piece of real estate, or a single sentimental keepsake from your accumulated holdings. Not $1, not one memory, nothing. His name is permanently stricken from your bloodline's legal continuity." Una Gomez nodded slowly in quiet approval, the tight lines around her eyes relaxing as she witnessed the ultimate consequence of greed finally meeting unyielding justice. "Next," Arthur continued, turning the document to page 4, "concerning the entirety of your late wife, Catherine's $88 million biomedical engineering trust fund, along with your accumulated personal pension and real estate holdings. The aggregate sum is to be formally partitioned and endowed into two monumental charitable instruments. First, $50 million will be immediately dedicated to establishing the Catherine Sterling Memorial Scholarship Fund, a permanent philanthropic endowment providing full tuition, housing, and living stipends for underprivileged, exceptionally gifted medical students attending Boston area universities who could otherwise never afford the punishing cost of medical education. Second, $38 million will be directly endowed to the Massachusetts General Hospital Cardiology Research Division, funding advanced genetic research into congenital heart conditions and structural myocardial pathologies, the exact scientific field that tragically claimed Catherine's life." Arthur pushed the thick stack of legal papers across the gleaming oak table toward us, uncapping a heavy silver fountain pen and offering it across the mahogany surface. "If you are in total, unreserved agreement with these provisions, we can officially execute, witness, and notarize your final testament today." I did not hesitate for a single microsecond. I reached out, took the balanced weight of the silver pen in my hand, and signed my legal name with a swift, bold, and entirely unbroken stroke across the signature lines, permanently severing 42 years of misplaced paternal devotion and redirecting the entirety of our family's fortune towards saving the lives of complete strangers. Arthur notarized the signature with his official license, adding his seal with crisp bureaucratic efficiency, while Una Gomez added her witness signature directly below his. The document was instantly locked into the firm's permanent digital vaults, becoming a binding, immutable legal reality. Catherine's legacy, which had nearly been weaponized by a parasitic predator to orchestrate my murder, was now safely transformed into a living, breathing monument of healing that would outlive every single lie, betrayal, and dark conspiracy ever plotted against my name. By late spring, the first tangible fruits of that monumental decision began arriving quietly at my Beacon Hill home, forwarded directly through Arthur's office to protect my ongoing privacy. They came in the form of thick, heavy paper envelopes arriving weekly in my mailbox, each one containing handwritten letters from medical students across the country whose lives had been utterly transformed by the Catherine Sterling Memorial Scholarship Fund. Sitting alone at my mahogany study desk in the warm afternoon sunlight, I carefully opened one of those letters and read the words penned in a neat, youthful handwriting. "Dear donor," the young woman began, "I am the very first person in my entire family lineage to attend college, let alone gain acceptance into a top-tier medical school. My parents immigrated to the United States from Central America, working 3 brutal manual labor jobs day and night to afford a tiny apartment and give me micro-opportunities they could only dream of. Winning the Catherine Sterling Scholarship means the terrifying, crushing mountain of student loan debt has vanished entirely from my shoulders. It means I can finally become the compassionate, dedicated physician my underserved community so desperately needs. Thank you from the very bottom of my heart for believing in a kid like me, and for keeping a brilliant woman's medical legacy alive through my hands. I read 17 similar letters that evening, each one detailing an inspiring, hard-fought story of human potential unlocked, academic dreams rescued, and future lives saved by the very fortune that had nearly cost me my life. These brilliant young men and women would go on to heal tens of thousands of vulnerable patients over the course of their medical careers, stepping inside operating rooms and emergency wards across the nation, carrying Catherine's name forward into the light. They were the true children of her legacy, the family she never got to raise, and the profound, eternal redemption born from the ashes of unimaginable betrayal. Standing up from my desk, I walked slowly over to the mantelpiece and looked up into the gentle, frozen eyes of Catherine's framed photographs smiling down at me from the shelf. "I couldn't save our son from the man he chose to become, Catherine," I whispered softly into the quiet, empty room, my voice the only sound echoing across the historic floorboards. He traded his soul for a pile of digital numbers and a gold-digging predator's promise. But these students, the ones he would have casually destroyed in his blind, unbridled greed, they are the true legacy you wanted. They will heal the broken world he tried to exploit, and they will save countless innocent lives carrying your name. I had spent 70 years of my life building a career rooted entirely in physical healing, 45 grueling years standing inside sterile operating rooms, manually restarting human hearts that had tragically stopped beating, aggressively fighting death at every turn. Yet, in the span of just 4 chaotic, violent months, I had been forced to learn the most agonizing, inverse lesson of my existence. I had been forced to use that exact same clinical precision, that exact same unyielding emotional detachment, to execute the legal and social execution of my own flesh and blood. Victory tasted like bitter ashes on my tongue, a profound and heavy reminder that true justice in this world is rarely accompanied by cheering crowds or Hollywood celebrations. More often than not, it leaves the victor standing completely alone in an empty room, wrestling with the heavy, inescapable ghost of what used to be. As I stood there at my study window, watching the golden twilight fade across the historic rooftops of Beacon Hill, I understood with absolute, unshakable clarity the ultimate hard-earned philosophy of our community here at Dad's Ultimate Payback. When family turns into a calculated conspiracy of theft and murder, your endless patience, your blind forgiveness, and your desperate compliance are never signs of noble virtue. They are simply weapons your enemies will eagerly use to dig your grave. True family justice does not live in naive weakness. It lives in your raw, courageous willingness to steel your soul, master your emotions, and silently sharpen the cold blade of absolute truth to defend your life, your dignity, and your peace before it is tragically too late. I could theoretically be entirely wrong about the complex, dark mechanics of the human heart, but deep down inside the core of my soul, I know with absolute certainty that I am not. If this harrowing story struck a resonant, awakening chord somewhere deep inside your spirit today, please take a moment to leave your honest thoughts in the comments section below right now. Share this video with someone who desperately needs to hear these vital words tonight, and subscribe to Dad's Ultimate Payback so you never miss the powerful, transformative journeys waiting ahead in the shadows. Thank you from the very bottom of my heart for staying with me until this final, quiet word. Your precious time and focused attention mean infinitely more to me than mere language can ever express. Always remember that while this narrative weaves in dramatized elements designed for deeper moral and emotional reflection, the underlying truths about survival, unyielding boundaries, and the true cost of justice are what truly matter most. Stand tall, keep your moral defenses completely unbreakable, and always take exceptionally good care of your heart.